Is Christianity a myth? Well, certainly some parts of it are. I mean, the religion exists, but the things it believes, well, those are not independently and rationally defensible. So maybe, sort of, kinda? I don't know. Depends on what you mean exactly. Confused? Yeah, you ain't seen nothing yet. We're going to do another IMBeggar video, mostly because somebody came to me with a video suggestion, and I take all of those, even though I may not eventually end up doing them all. And then I realized that I had one of his videos still in the queue, and of course, I'm just crazy. So I'm going to do this one, and then I'm going to do the suggestion sometime in the future. But these are going to be pretty painful. This is just going to show why Christianity is so damn stupid, as if we needed any more help. So, without further ado, let's get to it.
A lot of people will have these blocks. They'll say, I don't believe in God or Jesus or Christianity because I think it was all made up.
Certain parts of it certainly were. Gods have been used throughout history to allay people's fears and to explain the unexplainable, at least at that time. But there's no indication whatsoever that they're actually real. There have been thousands of gods invented by people because the idea was useful. It just wasn't demonstrably true. Jesus was at least partially a myth. Stories told by believers that changed over time because it was emotionally comforting. And Christianity, well, of course, I believe Christianity exists. I just don't think it's factually valid. You have no verifiable evidence that any of it ever happened at all, at least not the supernatural stuff. Maybe you'd like to trot that evidence out for us. No? Yeah, I didn't think so.
It's a myth or a fairy tale or a legend. They'll say that Jesus is just another mythical god pieced together from other mythical gods that already existed, such as Mithras, Horus, Dionysus, and others, or that there's really no evidence in the first couple hundred years that proves he even existed, or that some guy named Jesus, not the Son of God, probably did exist, but everything else about him was made up and added on later.
I just let that run on because there's a lot of stuff and it's just easier to handle it all at once. So, yep, that's pretty accurate. And in order to convince me otherwise, you're going to have some pretty solid evidence, and I don't think you've got any. Of course, I'm willing to let him try, but it is only evidence that's going to convince me, and no theist that I've ever talked to, and I'm into many, many thousands of theists at the moment who have tried, not one of them have ever come up with anything of any demonstrable value for their claims. They just really want it to be true, but that doesn't make it true. Granted, I know all of this is just an intro, so I'm not going to spend too much time here because it's not where he's really going. I'm hoping he's going to provide some evidence, something, to prove all of those misconceptions wrong, but let's be honest, who are we fooling? It's just going to be a whole lot of empty claims, blind faith, and it seems to me theology, because that's all they actually have. Now, maybe I'm jumping the gun, I don't know, so I guess we're just going to have to wait and see.
Now, I'm not going to say a lot about these, but I will say this.
If you're not going to say a lot about it, then why are you making a video in the first place? What is your point in all of this? I think it's an honest question, and as we all know, the religious don't have a lot of honest answers. They just really want to believe. But wanting to believe, that isn't enough. But I think I broke in the middle of a thought, so let's get back and see what he's going to say.
For the first, this idea that Jesus was just an amalgamation of other ancient mythical gods who, according to this, had virgin births, were baptized, had 12 disciples, performed the same miracles, and were crucified, died, and resurrected as Savior of the world. Well, none of this is true.
Actually, it is. All of those elements demonstrably exist in other predating mythologies, whether he likes it or not. His only potential saving grace, and I've heard this a ton from other theists, is the claim that if it wasn't absolutely identical in all the details, then it can't have anything at all to do with Jesus. But that's just bullshit. Joseph Campbell used to say that people borrowed from the myths around them. They didn't copy, they just grabbed elements that they liked and incorporated them into their own stories about the world. If we looked at the flood myth, for instance, it has a lot to do with the Hindu flood myths, down to their version of Noah having sons, and one of those sons seeing Noah naked and their Noah version, therefore condemning that son, while he gave the vast lands to his other sons who weren't evil. It's the same story, run through a different cultural filter. Different names, different places, slightly different details, but the underlying ideas remain consistent. The idea of Jesus as the Messiah wasn't original. It had been going around the Jewish belief system forever. The Jews talked to other people from other cultures, they exchanged stories, and those stories intermingled. That's just the reality of how things work. By the time that there were messiahs on every street corner, which was the case at the time Jesus was supposedly around, they were primed to accept this conglomerated Jesus tale, part Jewish mythology, part stories that sounded good to them from the outside, and part emotional comfort. And that's where Christianity came from. It doesn't matter if you like the idea or not. That is demonstrably what happened. But hey, let's see your spiel anyway. Hopefully it's something interesting to look at.
These claims can all be traced back to a couple guys in the 18 and 1900s who had no evidence.
Wrong! We've known forever that these other religious messiahs existed and that they all had very similar characteristics to the biblical Jesus. He's just projecting. He has no evidence, but he doesn't like the idea and therefore, well, it just can't be true, right? Except that's not how evidence works. We can actually trace the movements of the myths across time and across cultures. We know with surprising accuracy when the people over there got the information from the people way over there and incorporated it into their beliefs. I mean, seriously, go read Joseph Campbell's Masks of God series, especially Volume 2, which covers Eastern mythology. It lays it all out there in quite a bit of detail. I've got my own copy sitting right here on the corner of my desk as we speak. We have the evidence. We have the smoking gun, and the religious just don't like it. I find it funny that they, who have no evidence, pretend that others have no evidence when we do. Pot calling the kettle black, huh? But if it is so easy to prove wrong, let's see him do it, because I don't think we're going to be impressed.
Actually, all the evidence we do have shows these ancient mythical gods were really nothing like Jesus at all.
Not identical is not completely different. I knew he was going to get there sooner or later. I told you so before. Because this is the only card that he really has to play. He has to believe that Jesus was a real boy, but they've got no evidence whatsoever to support it. They just take that part on faith. Then when Jesus starts to look an awful lot like other mythic figures, they get really upset because they can't accept that. You know, faith and fifis and all. And they have to insist that Jesus, their personal interpretation of Jesus, well, that had to be real. You know, all the stories are true and stuff. So there. But that's not impressive at all. So explain why there are all of these mythic parallels, a lot of them predating the time of this supposedly real Jesus. And they don't have any answers, they just have excuses. Big surprise there.
Which is why every scholar, archaeologist, and Egyptologist dismissed these claims a long time ago.
They don't, though. In fact, a lot of the biggest names in cultural anthropology are completely on board with it. This is also why the religious are so fast to just dismiss mythicists out of hand. They can't handle the idea that their imaginary friend wasn't real, so they just wave away anyone who disagrees with their preconceptions, because obviously they can't be wrong, can they? That would make them sad. But your emotional state doesn't have anything to do with the state of actual reality. Maybe you should get that through your head. Maybe you should try.
So we can throw this one out, and this is the one that's all over the internet. For the second, this idea that there's no evidence within the first few centuries that proves Jesus even existed, well, there's plenty of evidence.
No, there isn't. There are plenty of claims. There's a whole lot of faith, but faith and claims are not evidence. Going by his logic, with some pretty huge air quotes there, you'd have to conclude that Elvis didn't die because there were so many eyewitness sightings for years after his death that it just had to be true, right? Except that's not how reality works. You have to remember that the very first Elvis sighting after his death was on the very same day he was buried. And that's a hell of a lot better than you can say for Jesus, isn't it? That is not how any of this works. That's not how rationality works. Evidence is external to the claim. Evidence is demonstrable. Evidence is testable. Evidence isn't just words that you really want to be true. It's objective. It's something that can be studied by anyone without requiring any preconceptions or faith first. So you have no evidence. You just have claims. You just have faith. And I'm sure he's only going to talk about the Bible or stuff like that, although, as I haven't seen it yet, who the hell knows, but that's my prediction going forward. Let's find out if I'm right.
Just open a Bible, New Testament. Those are all first century accounts written by a bunch of very different guys who were all alive when Jesus was alive.
See? What'd I tell you? But we know that's not verifiable. Now, I think it's interesting the way he put that. Not that there were eyewitnesses, but they were alive when Jesus was alive. But that's not defensible either, is it? Especially when you get to the later books in the New Testament. But we know that the Gospels were written anonymously, that Paul, whoever the hell that was, since we have absolutely no information about Paul outside of biblical sources, we know that these people were just writing about stuff they heard, because even Paul didn't claim to have ever seen Jesus in real life. Sure, there was a person who wrote the authentic Pauline epistles, but we know nothing about them beyond what they wrote. We don't have Saul's birth certificate, metaphorically speaking. We have to trust that what he wrote was true. And that doesn't necessarily make it true, does it? It all comes down to faith, and I reject faith wholeheartedly. So, was there a guy? Yes, because he left evidence behind with his writings. Do we know anything demonstrable about that guy? No. No, we don't. And because we don't, because we have no way to verify what he or any of the other authors said, we've got an awful lot of reasons to doubt what they claimed.
There's also non-Christian evidence from Jewish and Roman historians, from those who are opposed to Jesus, and from those who didn't even like him.
None of those people were even alive when Jesus supposedly was. Josephus wasn't born until 37 CE. He didn't know Jesus. Jesus, any real historical Jesus, was long gone and in the ground. This gets absurd when you start talking about people who wrote in the mid to late 2nd century as, they knew Jesus. No, they didn't. Tacitus was born around 55 or 56 CE. Not an eyewitness. Pliny the Younger was born in 61 CE. Not an eyewitness. Suetonius was born in 69 CE. Lucian was born in 120 CE. We really know very little about Celsus. We have a few fragments of his book, and Origen talked about him, but that's about it. According to Origen, Celsus was born in the first half of the 2nd century, so not an eyewitness. So where are these people who were alive when Jesus was supposedly around and wrote about him? Name one!
But those who hold this view argue that all the evidence was either forged, altered, or made up.
No, it was just stories passed on from people who believed it. That doesn't make it true. They just believed it. Just because you believe a thing, that doesn't make it so. Just because you really want a thing to be true, that doesn't mean that it is. These are stories that came through a long game of telephone, told person to person to person, and no doubt altered in the retellings. Just because you really want these stories to be true, that doesn't make them true. That requires evidence, and you have none.
There's really no evidence of Alexander the Great until 400 years after he died, but he existed, right?
Who cares? There's no existing writings until 400 years later, but we have shit tons of evidence that predate all of that. Thousands and thousands and thousands of coins minted with his picture on them, produced during his reign. If you look at the Babylonian royal diary, which was kept for millennia, it mentions the day that he died specifically. There are contemporary administrative documents from Bactria written in Aramaic, which records the moment of Alexander's arrival in Bactria while he was chasing the assassin of Darius III. We actually think we know where his body is. We know that after his death, he was being transported back to his home when Ptolemy stopped the caravan since he wasn't really doing a whole lot on his own, stole the body and stashed it in Alexandria as a claim to his own right of kings as the Pharaoh of Egypt. Currently, it was thought that Alexander the Great is in the tomb attributed to Mark, but the church won't allow science to verify it because I think they know they've got nothing to gain and everything to lose if they do. They kind of learned their lesson with the forged Shroud of Turin, and all the evidence shows that that's the most likely explanation, but we don't know, and we'll probably never know, but there's a ton of evidence for Alexander the Great that you don't remotely have for Jesus, and you got to get that through your head.
Even if you don't believe in Jesus Christ, Son of God, you can't just throw away all the evidence. That's too easy.
But there is no evidence. There are only claims. I don't care if it's easy. I care if it's true. The religious, they just want to believe it, but I only care about the facts. Where are the facts? The demonstrable facts. The facts that you can actually back up. Make sure you present those, won't you? Because I don't think you can. Oh, because they can't, because they don't actually exist. And this is where you get the religious whining, but you don't have evidence for most people in antiquity. You're right. We don't. So what? I'm not claiming that those people are real or that they matter. You are. If you want me to accept that this specific person from antiquity existed, then you have to have more than, but I believe it, because I don't care. You have to be able to demonstrate it to me in a way that is rationally convincing. If somebody comes up to me, as actually happened on Reddit maybe a half hour ago, and said, but you don't have evidence to believe that Plato is real, fine. I don't care. If it turns out Plato wasn't real, I don't give a shit. Doesn't affect me in any way, shape, or form. I don't care. But Christians can't do that with Jesus, can they? They can't just say, well, if Jesus wasn't real, so what? They have to have Jesus, because without Jesus, their entire theology collapses. You have to be able to do better than, but I really believe it. And they have not done so. I don't accept your empty claims without evidence. You just have to do better.
Which is why today nearly all historians, whether Christians or not, accept that Jesus existed. Bam.
And we've done that before. Consensus means absolutely nothing. Only evidence does. What is your acceptance based on, and where can I examine your evidence to find out if it stands up to rational scrutiny? Because it sounds good to me, or it's a mundane claim, or for the sake of argument. None of those are impressive at all. You have to do a whole lot better than that. Fuck consensus. Produce the evidence. I don't care what everybody agrees on. I care what everybody can prove. And they can't because they don't have any. The second you say that, they're completely flabbergasted. They don't know how to respond. Then they start insulting you and walk away because they have no actual evidential support like they need. And that's kind of a them problem, don't you think?
Which brings us to the last one, that some radical preacher named Jesus probably did exist, but everything else about him was religious embellishment at best or completely and totally made up at worst.
Or this is just another case of human inventiveness, which we have more examples of than we need. Telephone is a game. It always winds up the same way, with the story at the end bearing very little resemblance to the way it all started out. There is the assumption that all of these tales were accurately transmitted because that's what they want to believe. But they reject that for any other religion, don't they? Islam claims that the teachings of Muhammad were accurately memorized by his followers and written down later. So why don't Christians accept what it says in the Quran? Because they don't want to, because they don't care. They are emotionally attached to their own told tales, but not to anyone else's. However, your own warm fuzzies don't equate to truth, and that's why I care only about the demonstrable evidence, and they still don't have any. I'm sure the people who told the stories thought it happened. They thought it was accurate. They thought that what they remembered from when they were told it, that they were telling it the same way to the next guy, but we know that human memory doesn't work that way. It's why testimony is so horribly unreliable and the least reliable thing you can have in a court of law. And that's all they had to go by for the first couple of decades. That doesn't make any of it true, and they've got to get that through their heads.
Some say it was made up by his disciples, the Romans, by Constantine, by a bunch of rich white guys in Rome who wanted a lot of power, or just by sitting around the campfire telling stories over and over and over again.
I don't think any of those are true. I don't think it was a conscious effort to deceive necessarily, although there are dicks out there and always have been. I think it was just humans doing what humans do, talking about stuff, and as the human memory is inherently fallible, stuff just changes in the repetition. When you have nothing but verbal tales being told for decades on end, it's virtually impossible to keep the story straight. In fact, how would the early followers even know if they had the right story? It's not like they can just look it up online. They heard it from someone who heard it from someone else, and so on, and so on, and so on, and so on, with really no way to go back to the original source to verify that the story that you've got is the same one they told. They are also subconsciously encouraged to make their story the best story they could. It's not necessarily dishonest because we all do it. That fish you caught, that just keeps getting bigger and bigger in the retelling, right? Why? Because you want to feel like your religion is better than the surrounding religions. Humans are naturally competitive. They want to feel like they are better, even incrementally so, than others in their own little in-group. Early Christians wanted to convince members of other local religions that their religion was better. So embellishing it a bit here and there, even if you're not doing it specifically to deceive, that's normal human behavior. We see it all the time, both in religious and non-religious circles. It's not necessarily dishonest, but it absolutely is human nature, and we can prove that it happens.
Well, the earliest evidence of Christianity that's pretty solid shows it was already fairly well established by around 64 AD.
So what? Because we can show that the belief that Elvis was still alive was firmly established within weeks of his own burial. Big deal. That doesn't mean that Elvis is still alive. The first story that Elvis was still alive came on the very day that he was buried. Somebody saw him at a bus stop or something like that. I don't remember the actual details. The idea that this couldn't have happened that fast is just absurd. We can see it happening in a matter of days, weeks, not decades, which is what happened in the case of Jesus, especially when you're talking about a very small number of people in a very confined area, which is what happened with the Jesus followers. You are going to get a very strong belief in a very short amount of time. Hell, go research some of the local lake monster tales sometime. You can get all of the locals on board really, really fast. But that doesn't make the lake monsters real, does it?
And most of the New Testament is thought to have been written between the 50s and the 70s.
Not really. I mean, Mark was somewhere in the late 60s, maybe up to 75 CE. Matthew was around 75 CE. Luke was 80 to 90, and John somewhere between 90 and the early part of the 2nd century. Nobody thinks they were written that early. Nobody that isn't relying on blind faith and wishful thinking, at least.
So we know it couldn't have been made up after this. And it's unlikely that his disciples made it up because, well, they all died very brutal, violent deaths for it.
Says who? Oh, right, church tradition. For most of these supposed disciples, they just kind of vanished from history the moment that their part in the Bible ended. Then the church came along and made a bunch of stuff up with absolutely no evidence to support it. Besides, who cares? Just because you die a horrible, brutal death, that doesn't mean the stuff in your head is actually true. People die for stuff that is demonstrably false all the time. Just because you believe it, that doesn't make it so. This is one of the things that pisses me off the most about the religious. They think that just because they really like an idea, that must make that idea true, and that is total nonsense. Just because you've been told a story all your life, that doesn't make it so. Go out and try to verify it beyond the comforting confirmation bias in your own echo chamber, and maybe you'll have a point. You won't be able to do it, but hey, at least you will have tried, because I know I tried, and look where I ended up.
And yes, people die all the time for things they believe are true, but would you die for something you knew was a lie?
That assumes that they knew that it was false. You haven't established that. They could have been completely convinced that what they believed was true and been wrong. Look at the Heaven's Gate cult. They really believed that there was a spaceship in Halley's Comet, and if they just killed themselves before it got there, they'd be whisked away to whatever it is, whatever they believed. Whatever it is, they believed it. They were just stupid, but they believed it. It was still wrong, though, wasn't it? So this is where we're going to stop for the week. I honestly didn't think this was going to be a long video, but there's just so much concentrated stupid here that it just all has to be addressed, so it's going to be 2 videos. I know this is IMBeggar we're talking about here. I knew that going in, but I'm always shocked at just how dumb these people really are. I mean, really concentrated, activated, unadulterated stupidity. It's no wonder what they believe, but it still kind of gets you when you say, God damn, they're dumb, aren't they? And speaking of that, I just had another encounter with a theist who was trying to justify absolutely everything they said from a Christian perspective. Yeah, I don't care about your perspective. I don't care about your faith. I don't care about your worldview. He tried that one too. It's like, here's all the shit that I just assume is true, so from all of my bald-ass assumptions and wishful thinking, it's entirely justifiable that everything I believe has to be true, so there. The second that I pointed out that none of that was remotely rational, he ran away. The moment they can't rely on just wishes and dreams and here's what I believe, they can't handle the conversation anymore. They can't justify any of it rationally. They just really want it to be true. They really want to believe. Oh, he paused for a couple of parting shots, which is always a mistake. I just pointed out that everything he was doing was wrong, how it was all just standard operating procedure for the religiously delusional, and of course, I got in the last word, at least so far. Who knows if he'll even come back, but we'll see what happens. I honestly could predict when these people are going to head for the hills because they all do it. The second they get outside of their echo chamber, the second they get outside of their comfort zone, they don't know what to do with themselves. I said that, which is why he ultimately ran, because he knew that he wasn't going to get anywhere with me. Nobody is going to buy, but I believe it, and nobody should. You can't just let these people get away with their childish victimhood narratives. Call them out on their bullshit. The only thing they could do to disprove it is to stick around and have an intelligent adult conversation, which they absolutely cannot do. They can't. They won't. They just run. Because what the hell else is new?